I would like to take up maybe on some things that we heard about by Berthoin and Antal, about how organizations function with respect to artistic interventions, because as it seems, it's much more, of course, oriented to current processes that happen there. While I have a feeling that with museums, very often, there is a kind of, at least to me, a kind of discrepancy where you have, on the one hand, you have the museum as an institution that very often seems to be historical. It's there, it has history, the objects have a biography and all these things. And then, most notably in this museum here, because it's a research museum, you have research, current research that is going on. And while I think in organizations, the interventions are very much concerned about the current research. With museums, it doesn't seem to be like that. So my question would first of all be to the artist, Darcy Wilson, if that's sort of an observation you could share, or if you could say, if you are, when you do these kind of works, would you be more interesting in sort of working with the history of the institution and its displays, or with the current research that is happening, and maybe where do you think are the potentials of this kind of involvement on maybe both levels, and what are the challenges or difficulties in doing so?
I think, perfect. Yeah, I think there's so many possibilities, and it is so hard to kind of pin that down. I'm speaking from my own perspective. Sometimes, like the video that you just saw, or sorry, that we did not see, but may see later, but with the piece Tuck, that piece was created because of the history of an institution. And so it wasn't necessarily about the research happening in that museum, it was really about its narrative. And that's what inspired that work, and that's been repeated again in response to different, I mean, you saw the piece repeated twice, in response to the Flamingo at the Rooms Provincial Collection and the Museum of Natural History in my hometown. But sometimes for me, it might be research of a specific specimen. I've just created a project tracking specimens collected from my hometown of Halifax and shipped in kind of in an act of sort of repatriating them or honoring them, flew to visit them and lay memorial wreaths by them. That's another project. But I really think it depends on the artist. I mean, it's so, and what they're wanting to do. I think sometimes working in the museum, there are potentially barriers, and one of the barriers could even be understanding how to reach out to a museum or how to make the connection. And I think that's been something for the project that you've seen. I made the connection and reached out to the institution, and there are smaller spaces that weren't used to working with artists necessarily. It's been really inspiring to be here and see a whole team of people committed to bringing artists and museums together, and that's, I think, going to really facilitate things and make it a lot easier. Don't want to talk too much here.
Maybe we can pass the question on also to Gabi Hartel, who has done sort of also behind the scenes tours with the artists that you have been curating with here to discuss it. So maybe could you say something about their relation to sort of what they could see at what I would call the front end of the museum, which is the display and exhibition spaces, and the back end where the research happens, and how they could foster their interest in both realms?
Well, I think you mentioned something that was really interesting. I mean, obviously, there are a huge number of possibilities, and that was, I think, also that entails a huge risk for the people who actually facilitate these artistic interventions, because, you have, as I was saying, I chose these, 3 sets of artists, particularly because I knew that they would be completely open, that they would not enter the space in an attitude of knowing. Maybe I should say that I'd approached another artist, and she said, and I think that's amazing that she did, it sounds just like a Tacitadine project, and I think I'm not going to do it. So Tacitadine thought that she might, run the risk of approaching it in an attitude of knowledge. So the thing was actually that the artists who've worked here so far had the whole museum at their disposal. And it was you know, it was mainly thanks to Anita Hermannstetter that she kind of, you know, she sort of ordered the terrain or checked the terrain before I even came in to figure out who of the people behind the scenes are curious and open and willing and just, you know, just wanting to see what might happen. So it has happened that, I mean, and then I brought in the artist A.K. Dolven, and I said, well, look, no, then I came in, and I, you know, like all the other curators, we were allowed to take a tour through this fascinating museum, and then I thought maybe that space and that space and that space might be interesting for the following artists. And I really have to say that the colleagues behind the scenes were, of course, protective about their whatever they had. I mean, some of these, for instance, the cases in which the, you know, the bird specimen are kept are highly, you know, they're really vulnerable and fragile. So, but as I was saying, they were extremely open, and they helped artists, you know, check out the terrain and then decide we want to, you know, do our, you know, our intervention here rather than in the library. But it is a long process. It took a lot of time, which is important, as you were just saying. And I think that's the beauty of this project, that you're actually allowed this time.
And it also, just to add to that, that element of trust, too.
Totally.
And trusting the artist, and that's something that I'm very aware of as an artist approaching an institution, is that it's actually, there's so much potential for it to be a wonderful relationship and a wonderful project, but in some ways it's asking a lot to go to an institution and approach and ask to have your project facilitated in that way. Or so yeah, I think it's good to...
Maybe I can just pick up the word, you know, the expression of trust, because obviously it's very important that the artist also trusts, say, the intermediary, to then maybe come in and say, you know, discuss the work. So these works have been developed in a closed dialogue with, you know, the project management, if you like, and myself as a curator, and that is not the usual, it's not a normal process. You very often find artists just knowing what they want to do, but that there was actually, it very much came out of a dialogue between the three of us, which I think is kind of unusual for this project.
Many of these works might sort of look rather as, or might appear as interrupts in the museum. They might be very different from what is on display, which is also a question of trust, that you will be surprised as museum staff later on by what you see, which will be even opposing your mode of display. But now we learned from Mr. MacGregor that actually there's a kind of, I sense a different topic here, because what you've been basically arguing for is that the artwork complements the scientific image that was there before and rather strengthens it. So my question would be in regard to, maybe also with regard to what you're planning for the Humboldt Forum, but also more in a general sense, is where do you think is the potential of either integration of these works, almost seemingly blending artifacts and artworks in, or using art as a form to irritate, so to be like different, to be off the regular mode of display?
Thank you. Clearly it's both. And I realized that with artists on the panel, there was going to be more about the disruption rather than the continuation by different means. But I think one of the extraordinary things an artist can do intervening in a collection of things, so not a natural history museum, a museum like the British Museum, is to remind the visitor that everything they're looking at was made by a person and was made very carefully and very slowly. And in the British Museum, we had a wonderful project with Grayson Perry, the potter. His argument was, particularly if you look at the stone tools, that actually to make a stone tool is to create a very sophisticated work of art. You need to imagine what you're going to do, you need to chip it all away, your material is difficult, your instruments are even more difficult, and every stone tool, every hand axe, every arrowhead is a creative achievement. I think that's a very, very helpful thing, that because most of us, when we work in museums, you present a set of objects as this will tell you something about the Roman Empire or whatever. What is extremely hard in the context of that is to remember that what it's always about is a person struggling with a material. and trying to do something with it. And that kind of intervention is, I think, completely transformative. And it humanizes the objects in a very remarkable way. And I think there's almost no limit to how that can be used. It's not disruptive in the sense of it doesn't challenge why the object is there. It does enormously expand what the object can do in the accepted humanistic view of museums, collections being about what it means to be a human being confronting reality. It individualizes a general collection, and that's something only an individual artist can do.
I thought you wanted to respond. With regard to that discourse that can, of course, then happen in the more...
we're in business, sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. Should we go on? Okay. Sorry. With regard to this discourse that can happen in that way, which is a great benefit, I think, of museums, that it can happen in a public sphere because they have the opportunity for display. I think we have a different situation in organizations that do not have this kind of public display, but also I think there's a different kind of chance because you have this semi-protected environments where people can discuss these topics also amongst themselves. But my question is, because I think we could also learn from that in these types of interventions, could you say something more, Berthoin, about how these institutions set up a kind of controlled spaces? Is this something you could access in your investigations? How these spaces looked like, and what kind of materials were used there, and how the discourse was moderated in there in a way? Were these regular gatherings, or how did they institutionalize it in terms of space?
It would be so nice for you if I could give you one answer, but there isn't. So, Tilt is an intermediary in Sweden that has a lot of experience, and there's another one in Spain, Improbables. They both have a method. This way? Okay. I thought it was close enough. They both have a method that does have an introductory session for the organizations and the artists. They have one in the middle of the process and they have one at the end in order to support the reflection process. So that's an intermediary that has a method. But in most other organizations, they have to figure it out for themselves and see what resonates with the organization, what resonates with the process. Intermediaries can be very, very helpful because there are moments of crisis. In any original process, there's going to be at least one crisis. And for an artist working for the first time with a particular organization, this can be very difficult. And for the employees working for the first time with an artist, this can be very destabilizing. So working with an intermediary who can be accompanying the process and helping work through issues, not make them disappear, but work through things that are crises that can be learning moments, I think is important. So I can give you a partial answer, but part of it is the creativity and that enabling things to happen and working with the possibilities that get opened there. So there's not a cookie cutter solution to how do you do artistic interventions. And I think that's why it's important to do what you're doing, and some of the other cases I've done that I've studied, they from the beginning plan to do a whole series, realizing that if they just did one, they think that they've got the cookie cutter solution. They think, I know how to deal with these artists, so now we've got it under control. Control word I would drop from the vocabulary around trying to work with artistic interventions. But if you have the courage then from the beginning to say, let's try a series, and each one will be different, and how can we do something in this co-learning mode, however it is that it works for that question, for that constellation of people. I think the trusting the individuals and trusting the process. Sean McNiff speaks of trusting the process. I think that's a crucial dimension to it. Not thinking if I'm going to figure it all out in the beginning and then see how we walk along the way, but more realizing if you've got the good ingredients, something special can happen. There's a sense of mystery that is important at the heart of it for something special to happen.
Yeah,
just to add something to that as well, just from my experience as an artist and often working with like I mentioned, kind of smaller institutions or places. And of course, I'm based in Atlantic Canada, which is a very small region. So that's, anyway. Yeah, I think coming in, a strategy that I've kind of worked with is just that, just being so open and kind of humble and opening that discussion between the institution, and the co-learning is so important, but something that you touched on in your presentation was the other audience of employees or staff or people who are working in that sphere. And I think some of the most rewarding experiences that I've had working in either the museum or wildlife rehabilitation centers have been those quiet, understated moments with just a few people behind the scenes, or with biologists in the laboratory or watching me set up a scene, or the staff who are caring for injured wildlife, as I did a project where I would deliver them handmade quilts for their stay and care at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. So the staff were watching them kind of rip up the blankets and then washing the blankets. And I think there's something really magic about those intersections, and that relationship is one of the most rewarding for me working in that way. But
and maybe I would also like to pick up on something you said about, that you have to be careful not to functionalize art. And that was particularly in that project where A.K. Dolvin went up to the North Atlantic to record those, the fish mating. That was definitely, I mean, I wasn't there, but on that boat, that was definitely an interspace, which you've just mentioned. And apparently it was really difficult as well, because she had picked a fjord where they wanted to do the recordings, but then the weather just didn't comply. So they actually had to drag, the curator and Anita out of the plane, go to a different fjord, and then start recording. And in the end, there was a lot of waiting involved, and it might just not have happened. They might just not have been able, it's just never been done. These fishes have never been recorded. So there was that moment involved which could have meant complete failure. They could have come back, all this money wasted, and then one of the rewarding, moments for me is when they came back and the curator from the Animal Sound Archive said that he suddenly discovered that working as an artist and working as a scientist were very, very similar. With all these moments, you have to deal with the potential failure, and that is something you can't functionalize.
I'd like to pick up on the word failure, because for me that's been one of the very important things that people have told me about. It legitimizes, having an artist and working with artistic interventions legitimizes talking about failure. And if you're going to try to do something special, if you're going to really do something innovative and new, and we're constantly calling on innovativeness and creativity in society, but we're not supposed to really take risks, it's supposed to be a sure bet, it's not going to work that way. And so talking with artists who are taking risks, because it might not work. Something will happen, but it might not work as expected. And so learning how to deal with that feeling in organizations is one of the aspects that's most important. And I was struck, I was talking with colleagues who were doing research about dealing with failure, comparing artists and entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. And I thought, well, that's pretty obvious. They're so proud of having failed in Silicon Valley. That's your badge of having succeeded, is because you failed in 2 or 3 other projects beforehand. And the researchers said, no, there's a qualitative difference between how these entrepreneurs are talking about their successful failures and how the artists are talking about failures, because artists are really digging in and trying to reflect on what it was, and then seeing what do they want to do and what do they want to do differently and what do they want to do the same. Whereas the entrepreneurs have learned to talk, it's cool to have failed, and then we try again. But they don't actually benefit, they don't learn from that experience. They don't delve into the failure process, the whole failure experience. They just move on from it and use it as a badge of courage. I think that's something we need to learn much, much better as a society. If we're going to do something new, we have to take the risk of failure. So how do we learn to be creative in failure, and how do we learn to be generative after a failure, and do something different, something that we find satisfying?
Exactly, and maybe I should add, and I'm sure you can back me up, that an artist who fails, I mean, it's not he or she is on his own after the failure, and then how do you build yourself up? So I think that's a complete crucial difference to, the entrepreneurs.